Welcome, everyone, to the Real News Network. I'm Maximillian Alvarez, the editor-in-chief here at the Real News, and it's great to have y'all with us. It will be no surprise to anyone who produces or consumes independent media that it's quite a struggle, right? In the kind of super saturated digital age, media outlets doing important work are finding it harder than ever to expand beyond their algorithmically sorted echo chambers and to have the impact that we all want to have. And of course, to find the sort of sustainable funding base that would allow us to continue to do the important work that we are committed to. And we wanted to take a moment to talk about these openly and frankly. And honestly, I could not have asked for a better guest to navigate this thorny question than our guest today, Laura Flanders, who is the executive producer and host of the Laura Flanders Show. Laura interviews forward thinking people about the key questions of our time on The Laura Flanders Show, which is a nationally syndicated radio and television program reaching more than 200 million viewers weekly on over 270 public television stations. The program is also free on YouTube and as a podcast. A contributing writer to The Nation, Laura is also an author of 6 books, including the New York Times bestseller Bushwomen, Tales of a Cynical Species. She is also the recipient of a 2019 Izzy Award for Excellence in Independent Journalism, the Pat Mitchell Lifetime Achievement Award for Advancing Women's and Girls' Visibility in Media, and a 2020 Lannan Cultural Freedom Fellowship for her reporting and advocacy for public media. Laura, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Max. It all sounds so good when you read the description that way, but boy, those thorns of that thorny issue of how do we do this independent media work are biting and sharp. And I know that you feel them too. So it is a real honor to be able to kind of kvetch a little bit with you, as we say in New York, and to talk about, what it means to be part of an ecosystem. I always say, media is a plural noun. We don't any of us do this alone. So glad to be with you.
Oh yeah. Well, as viewers can see, this is why we love Laura. This is why we love her show. Everyone watching should go check it out if you haven't already. And yeah, Laura, I would be lying if I didn't say that as excited as I am to do this interview from, like just the content of the discussion alone, as the editor-in-chief of the Real News, talking to someone who has seen so much and done so much in the media over the years, I am also coming to you asking you, what do we do? How have you done it? How have you managed to have such an illustrious, amazing, impactful career in media in the kind of sort of privatized, corporatized hellscape of the American media landscape? So why don't we start by talking about that? Like, what are the real kind of struggles that you have faced in your career and that we are all collectively facing now to do the kind of important work that we can do in independent media?
Well, I've been at this a while, Max, and I appreciate you being so gracious about that. Yes, I've been doing this a long time, and I have to say, on the one level, there's been tremendous progress in the correct direction, forward towards more inclusion, fewer gatekeepers. When I started out, it was the 1980s, and in order to make our opinions heard and felt at anything like a mainstream news outlet, the New York Times or, any of the television networks, you had to kind of write a letter to the editor and put it in a mailbox and hope that somebody would read it, which they never did. In those days, you could go to a war zone and see an important newsworthy event. I went to Northern Ireland and I went to the Middle East and saw the wall get knocked over in Berlin. But if you didn't have a way of getting it out there, your story kind of died at that moment. So, there have always been people in this country going back to the earliest days of the Republic and even before the Revolution. Let's remember, Tom Paine was an independent media guy, um, who were telling a different story than the elites, who were contesting power with their storytelling. And we've always found a way to do that. But in the years since the 1980s to today, I mean, you go to a war zone today, or you step outside your backyard, you have a reporting device right in your hand more likely than not, and you can get out to the world. The question is how. And I think that what we're up against now is, while we have been riding a wave for a few decades of excitement around, fewer gatekeepers, the democratizing impact of the internet, we've also been living through an era of consolidation of wealth and control. And just as it's happened in our rest of our economy, so it's happened in our media economy. You have a few with an awful lot of money and wealth, and the rest of us who are just struggling to get by. So I often say to journalists, there's never been a better time to be a journalist, and there's never been a harder time to actually get paid. So I think that the way that I've always survived is following my heart, following the story, building relationships, knowing that if you leap, people will catch you. Your friends will create a net, and with them, you create a net that helps the truth get caught and bounce back to the public. We do it together, and we do it through annoying things like pledge drives, which I have to say we pioneered in radio at Pacifica Radio back in the 1950s, in the worst years of the Cold War. Now everybody's doing it. We're all crowdsourcing from the same crowd more often than not. It's not easy, but I'd rather be beholden to my viewers and listeners than Big Pharma or Big Oil. So them's our choices. Them's our options, as my grandmother would correct me. We do it anyway. What did Gramsci talk about? Optimism of the will. Yes, that dollar will come in. Usually it does. Sometimes we have to make a cut.
Yeah, so the kind of ever important question of how we get the funding to do this kind of important work. Like, I think in many ways anyone who's watching this, anyone who watches the Laura Flanders show or listens to the Laura Flanders show, anyone who consumes the content that we put out here at the Real News, I think will have an implicit kind of appreciation for what independent media can do and what it can be. But from our side, obviously, the ever present question is, how do we keep these operations going when we're constantly kind of hustling to get the funding that, as you said, Laura, we don't want to be beholden to the corporate advertisers and private interests that could dangle that money over us at the expense of our souls, really, at the expense of our editorial missions, right? We all know the score there. And so I think the question is, as you have asked, on your show recently, and I know that you've talked about this a lot before, is does it have to be this way? Is there another way that we could actually have a more robust and independent media ecosystem, because other countries do, right? I mean, and I think that this is something that you articulated brilliantly in a recent segment of the F Word that you did, called "A New Deal for Democracy: Invest in Public Media." And in that post, you wrote, quote, "America's nonprofit public media system needs more than a bailout. It needs Americans to buy in for the very first time," end quote. So can we talk about the elephant in the room here that you're referring to in this segment, which is just that, you know, other countries and other media ecosystems, media operations don't have to hustle as much as we do here in the US, because there is more of a robust public funding infrastructure for media. And in the US, we largely don't even know how to imagine such a thing. So could you talk for viewers a little bit about what that giant absence in our media ecosystem means?
Absolutely. I mean, there is a long and noble history in this country of mobilizing for the idea of public media, going back to the 1920s, 1930s, where you had church groups and civil rights groups saying, look, if we don't preserve a part of our then radio spectrum for public interest media, it's all going to be dominated by churches, ideologues, and corporations selling things. They fought then for us to have the right to call the public airwaves, and to charge, as it were, a license fee for private broadcasters to use those airwaves. And they had to show that they were serving the public interest. Those public interest rules that were established back in the days of FDR and before, um, today really lie in shreds. The licenses aren't challenged. We don't ask the stations to show us what they're doing for the public interest. We've even done away with anything having to do with mandated equal time. Instead, we've allowed corporations sort of to run riot over, run rampant over our media spectrum, online, on radio, on TV, cable, and satellite. And I think in that episode, I was calling for us to get brave again. Everyone's talking about a new deal, a new deal for this and for that in this moment of post pandemic, post recession, creating our world anew. Well, I'm not seeing that movement around media. I'm seeing some pushes for bailouts for journalists who are in trouble, for legacy papers that are having trouble around the country. But I'm not seeing us put together the next big ask about investing in non commercial public service media. And in this country, the one we've got is public television. It's not perfect. I get that. But it's partly not perfect because every 4 years, originally it was longer than that. I think it's now actually less than every 4 years. The heads of public television have to submit themselves to grilling in Congress. And so they've kind of watered down their content as much as they possibly can to a kind of fluidy, gruely substance that is the most they can get away with. Programmers like me are independent. We don't get a penny from public television, but I'm still glad it's there because it reaches into every home in America, whether they can afford costly internet or not. It's in blue states and red states, and a pesky little reporter like me, if I can pull together the dollars, can get my show distributed to 270 stations, reaching 200 million Americans where they live. With just the turn of the dial, public television doesn't even steal your data for surveillance. So I think we're due for a revival of the idea of public television. And if we get, vocal enough about the idea, I think we can make the service better. But we need to be shouting loudly that in most of the Western world, the governments pay on average about $100 per citizen for public broadcasting. Think of the BBC as just the most obvious example. Is it perfect? No, as they'll tell you in Northern Ireland, but nonetheless, it's there and it is public and it is non commercial and it is accountable to the parliament. We don't want government media, but we do need to be spending more than the dollar in comparison to 100, the dollar that we spend roughly per person on anything having to do with public media in this country. We could do better. There are great models out there of taxing advertising to pay for public media, of taking a pot of taxes to pay for public media. I mean, there's lots of ways we could do it. We just need to start demanding that it be done. Because otherwise, we're just left doing what you and I do all the time, Max, which is come to our viewers and listeners and say, please pay your pledge. Otherwise, we're going to have to give over our programming to the advertisers. And that's not what we're here to do.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, I think that, it's a really important kind of idea that I would really stress viewers to think about, because it's not as like, harebrained as it seems, right? Like Laura was saying, it exists. Like there are precedents for this. We've seen it. And I would also highly encourage folks to go read, this book by the great John Nichols and Robert McChesney, called The Death and Life of American Journalism, where they, also kind of come to this conclusion as well, where they write that, there are a lot of different ways that media outlets have tried to navigate the digital break that came, in the past 2 decades, try to find ways to fund our operations to become sustainable. And essentially, the conclusion they come to is all of these pale in comparison to having a robust public funding system to subsidize media operations. And therein, I think, is especially in America, that's where people start, closing up. That's where people get freaked out because, like you said, Laura, they immediately think that this is going to be state run media, right? They immediately think of like propaganda. And if we are putting public dollars into media production, that's opening a can of worms that Americans are especially allergic to. What I would really try to ask people to consider is that I want you to consider all the public funding that already goes to private entities that control other aspects of your media. We did a lot of reporting here at The Real News on Amazon. Amazon gets a shit ton of like public money, tax breaks, public resources, and they have a robust kind of media arm of their operation. So, in a sense, we're already doing this, but we're doing it for the larger corporations that are currently dominating and consolidating
And
in the
let's think
media
about the
ecosystem.
principle of the thing. I mean, the demand that McChesney and Nichols write about, the campaign that they write about in the 1960s and 70s was around cable. When people said, look, you're laying cable in the streets that we, the taxpayer, paid for, and you're digging up those streets to lay that cable, you better pay us back for the inconvenience. Plus, you've arranged things so that each city basically gives a monopoly to a single cable provider. If you want access to our market as a monopoly cable broadcaster, cable distributor, then we deserve some kickback. That's what they said in the 60s and 70s. And that's how we ended up with community access television stations that statutorily, under law, were required to get a appropriation from the city council based on how many subscribers they had. And that tax would be they were forced to pay a tax based on how many subscribers they had, and that tax would go into city funding for a public media center that had to be equipped with the latest technology, the training, the trainers, and be available to anybody in that city, first come, first served, along with the place on the dial, the channel to broadcast. And some of our cities, Philly is just one. There are many others in New York. I think Baltimore has one too. Community access television has been a thing. You never find out about it because the newspapers and there's no media to promote there's no money to promote what's on, but it's there and there's some good stuff. And when Occupy was going down, it was community access media that covered it long before the New York Times did, and that's just one example. So there was that fight in the 60s and 70s, but we have not fought around internet access, even though all of the spending that went into the origins of the web was public spending. Some of a few through the defense program, but not only there. Public investment for private profit has been de rigueur across American history, and nowhere more so than in media. And in the sense that media are so important to our democracy, as we've seen in the last few go rounds, and I'll just leave that at that. We need to claw some control back and some resources, if not just for appearances, but for the sake of any semblance of truth in our electioneering and in our democratic decision making. So we have a democracy to make here. We haven't done it yet, and we certainly can't do it depending on corporate media. And the sort of spectacle that we saw in the last few years of Congress people bringing the heads of Amazon and Facebook and Google and Twitter before them to sort of chastise them for being clickbait driven is absurd, because of course it's clickbait driven. We can go hoarse demanding that it be otherwise, but that is the nature of capitalist competition. What we need is a place that is free from that, protected from that. And that's what you and I make with our independent media. But it needs to be instituted in our media landscape and not resting on these fragile little pillars of people like you and me and the breath that we have to beg from our audience.
Yeah, man, like Congress berating like Facebook for the clickbaitification of media is like berating a bear for eating flesh. It's like, what do you think it's
Correcto.
gonna do? Right? Well, let's like kind of round up by kind of focusing on the Laura Flanders show itself, right, as an example, right, of what publicly funded or media that is beholden to the public, I would say, can be and should be. Like you were just talking about how this is a not just a question of like helping us at the Real News and the Laura Flanders show survive. It's a question of democracy, a robust media ecosystem that encourages people to not only be informed about their world, but that empowers them to act in that world and safeguard democracy itself. That was always the purpose of a free press, right? It wasn't just to keep us up to date on what's happening, it was to give us the information we needed to be effective democratic citizens. And so I wanted to ask if you could expand on that for viewers to show what that sort of model that you have, like what that allows you to do, and how what that says about why independent and media that's beholden to the public is so important for democracy as such.
Yeah, I mean, we always have to remember that free speech and the freedom of the press is written in the Constitution. The priority given to the postal service, which was then the mechanism by which people got their media, is written into the Constitution. It was considered so important by our founders. You know, we're in a new founding moment, I think, for this country. And I could have looked at this moment and said, you know what, I've been doing this a long time. It's time for other people to take over. But I looked at this moment and I said, what are we seeing? We're seeing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans tell pollsters that they want systemic change, whether it's healthcare or education or housing or just access to clean air and water and food. They tell pollsters they want things that they don't dare vote for at the end of the day, which is why you see a Bernie Sanders candidacy give way to a Joe Biden one. Um, it's why you see people, tell pollsters one thing and then vote something else. What I see in that is a lack of confidence that we can make the kind of change we aspire to, that we dream of in this country. And in order for people to feel that confidence that I think we need, not just to vote for a different candidate, but to build the movements that we need to pressure the candidates we have and to run for office and to support people that advocate and have models of systemic change. In order for people to have that confidence, they need to meet the people who are making some of that change that the corporate media tell us is impossible every day. And that's what we do on the Laura Flanders Show, whether it is creating a guaranteed minimum income program in California that's supporting formerly incarcerated women with children right now in a seamless way that's not losing them that's their benefits, that's changing their lives, or whether it's creating a land trust in busily gentrifying Buffalo, New York, where you would think it was impossible for a local Black community to stand up against the huge medical establishment on its frontier. Whether it is talking about what's happening in your backyard or what's happening in other countries where these issues, many of them, and these struggles, particularly around public resources and community wealth building, are well advanced. Um, those are the stories we bring every week to the public, courtesy of the Laura Flanders Show on TV, on radio, and on the internet. I think it's the work of introducing people to each other. I always say the work of the commercial media is to deliver the audience to the advertisers, and it's the work of the independent media to deliver us to one another, introduce us to one another, to our neighbors with whom we could be doing amazing things if we just knew the way and if we just had some belief that it could be done. So we have programming every week on what is being done, not just could be done, but is being done. And looking at some stories like the story that you helped report so brilliantly on the organizing of the Amazon warehouse workers in Bessemer, Alabama, reporting on it differently to say this wasn't a defeat for the workers necessarily, losing a unionization vote, because look at what they built. Look at the union that they created in all but name. We can stand together. And I think that what we've seen in the last few months is people standing together against incredible odds, to turn around Georgia, to get a conviction in the Chauvin trial, to cause some of the most powerful leaders in the country. I'm thinking of Andrew Cuomo in this moment to kind of quake in their boots. We can make extraordinary change in this country, and we always have. But most often we don't hear about it. We don't see it in the news. We don't see it on our TV. So we try to make change not just possible, but palpable. That's what we're here for. That's what we do. And that's what people are supporting when they support our pledge drive, which they can do between now and the end of Memorial Day. We've got $25,000 to raise, and we're super close. So I think Real News viewers could help tip us over that edge so that we can keep doing the work of tipping towards the tipping point that I think many of us really desperately want.
Yeah, I mean, for anyone watching, please do whatever you can to support the Laura Flanders Show. As you just heard, this work is vital right now in so many ways, and just from a personal standpoint, Laura, I think that you summed up beautifully why I'm so invested in the Laura Flanders Show and why I'm so appreciative of the work that y'all do, because especially when we're thinking about media from, like a kind of political angle, like media with a progressive heart, right? Media that wants to see change in the world that betters people's lives. In that realm, we have a lot of critique. We have a lot of reporting on why things are as terrible as they are, but we have a dearth of imagination and tangible kind of ways of imagining what the future can and must be. And your tagline for the show is, where the people who say it can't be done take a backseat to the people who are doing it. That is really, really, really crucial for so many people. I've talked to, a number of workers that I've interviewed for my show, for the Real News, who say, look, these talking points like canceling student debt or a green new deal, they sound great, but I don't know what they would look like, what they would mean for me in my daily life. Laura and her crew are showing people what it would look like, and that is a huge step forward for people who are constantly berated into believing things cannot be any different. And
And
so,
and we just wanna
oh,
do it
please.
more and more, Max. I mean, you and I can sit in a studio and sound off all we like, but what really makes a difference is when we, as you, can get into the streets and talk to people, go to where the stories really are, and increasingly in these times, at this point in my career, I wanna be able to support other reporters to go and do that storytelling, or people to report on what's happening in their own backyard. So that's what we're raising funds for right now, and am I allowed to give our website, Max?
Please do.
All right, so
Please.
the website is lauraflanders.org. That's pretty easy. lauraflanders.org/donate. And you can make a pledge for a small monthly amount, or you can make a one off contribution, or you can simply share the link with your friends and your family. We have just $5,000 left to raise between now and the end of Monday. I know that we can do it, but wouldn't it be great to just bust through that goal and on to the next one so that we can be funding and paying for a whole new crop of journalists to do this kind of work? Because I don't know, the one place that I feel so excited is about the journalists that are coming up and the people that are doing that storytelling on their phone. What if we could build the pipeline from those people to the fairly mainstream 200 million strong public television audience that a show like mine, or not like mine, but my show is reaching? Um, that's what I want to do. I want to build that pipeline, enable people not to have to do the 30 years of building that I've had to do, but rather take advantage of having created this now, to pipeline in a whole bunch of new people, new faces, new stories, and information that's not just additive to some of the very lacking reporting that we have now, but is indispensable, to our lives and our state of mind. So, this is just about doing better journalism, getting more people out there telling stories, and bringing down those gatekeepers that remain. People can support that program, then please go lauraflanders.org/donate, make a contribution. As we always say, if everybody watching now contributed just $5, I would have half a dozen new reporters, and Max and I would be in a watertight alliance of coverage, coast to coast, hour in, hour out. I can see the future, Max, can't you?
I can, and yeah, can't thank you enough for shining a light towards that future that I think all of us in independent media are running towards, and just to really drive that point home for anyone who is involved with media. What we are doing right now here is also an essential ingredient to that, because if we are going to kind of survive this sort of kind of hierarchical, corporate dominated media ecosystem, and if we're going to thrive in it, then those of us in the independent media sphere have to support one another. We have to not think like capitalists and think of this as a zero sum game. We have to think of it as a sort of alliance of truth that is trying to do the type of work that Laura described across our different platforms. So having that sort of mutual aid across independent media is also
I have
really
one
vital.
little story to tell, Max, which is, when the uprising happened after the killing of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, where was the first stop I made on the train? It was to the Real News. I know, and I knew then, that you're a hub for great information, for great people, and what the audience may be aware of, which is the programming that emits from that fantastic building and from the brilliant brains of people like yourself. Um, is just a tiny part of your significance to the city. you are a hub for a kind of progressive thinking and networking that is very, very rare. And we have to protect those little hubs of difference making, because they're the places. Like in my time, it was the local Pacifica radio station, WBAI, that was willing to take the call of a 23-year-old standing in the street in Northern Ireland who just watched somebody in front of her be shot dead by the police. I wasn't a qualified journalist. I didn't have a degree, but I knew I could call WBAI and they'd put me on the air. And that was kind of the beginning of my career. You've been the beginning. The Real News has been the beginning of many people's careers. And Eddie Conway can attest, it can sometimes give people a new career at a later point in their lives. So if you look across the country, I've always wanted someone to do a sort of mapping of where are our progressive voting hubs and centers of independent thinking and schooling and small businesses. And how does that track? How does that map against our independent media hubs? I think you would find a very close to close one-to-one correlation. I really do. And I think that without media, you don't have the glue that you need to sound an alarm, to throw a celebration, to get someone elected. Um, you need these media hubs. You are one. I'm happy to be in alliance with you. Uh, Individualism will kill us collectively, as people said during this pandemic. We saw it happen. We can't allow it to happen to us. So I hope people will contribute in your next pledge drive. And in the meantime, pony up a little for mine at lauraflanders.org. Thanks so much, Max. It's great talking to you. It's fun to have someone to commiserate with and celebrate with, too.
Likewise, yeah. Thank you so much, Laura. And to everyone watching, yes, please go support the Laura Flanders Show. We have till Memorial Day to help with their fundraiser. We've got one coming up here at the Real News, so please support us as well. It has been a genuine honor to be chatting with executive producer and host of the Laura Flanders Show. Laura, thank you so much for joining me.
You're so welcome anytime, Max.
This is Maximilian Alvarez for the Real News Network. Thanks for watching.